Good morning. Let's get started. So today we will see some more small concepts, a couple of them. So the first thing we'll learn how to build directives. Have you ever wondered we are using ng if or ng switch kind of directives and how to build them? So far with this course we got acquainted with how to develop components, how to develop services, and then route cards, routes, and pretty much everything except directives. The only part we don't know how to build is directives. So we'll learn today how to write them. The only difference between directives and components is directives will not have any view or template. So directives they work like a markers on DOM element. So they extend the functionality of a DOM. And the DOM element can be anything. It's H1 tag or P tag, whatever you want. So you want to add some functionality on the dumb HTML element, you can use directives. Directives makes it smarter and it makes it dynamic. So I'm in my shared folder. Let's go ahead and write our directive. We don't have any directive such as ng show where we had it in Angular 1, but we don't have. Let's see how can we write a show directive. I want to show and hide content based on certain parameters, and I'll try to write that directive. First thing, export a class. And instead of component decorator, you will have directive decorator. This is part of core again. And this will have a selector and a name of the selector. So I'm going to say show. And if you try to write a template property, it's not going to work. See? It will throw an error because template property doesn't exist on this element. So this object is a strongly typed object. You're trying to provide a property which doesn't exist on this object. So that's why it's throwing an error. So that proves that there is no template for this directive, and not just this for this directive, rather for any directives. Another thing, the way I've written selector is little different than the way that I've written for components. I'm wrapping it inside this angular brackets. The reason is, or square brackets. The reason is I want to use this directive as an attribute. So attributes are a common way, but there are a couple of ways that you can use directive that you can consume using a class, CSS class. But it is easy to overlook the class because you think that it's a CSS element. So it's always a good idea that you go with the attribute directive. So this is how you specify the name inside square brackets. So the directive that we are going to write is attribute directive, which doesn't modify the DOM structure. It just extends the DOM element. It won't modify the structure of the existing DOM. Okay, with that, I'll have a constructor here. And this constructor will give me element reference. Element reference is nothing but the element on which this directive is consumed. So this directive is going to be consumed on certain element. That is nothing but the reference of that element. So what you want to do with that element, you'll have access here. You have that element. And here, what I want to do is I just want to say native element is nothing but the HTML element dot style dot display equals to none. So I'm saying, okay, hide this element. We'll go step by step. First thing, we want to hide this as soon as this directive is consumed on certain element. So this directive is created. We need to add it to the module. Go to shade module and add it to the declarations because this is related to view. So this is going to be show directive here. Add an import statement. And now we are ready to consume it anywhere. So one thing is that my components, usually your directives are consumed from your component. My components are part of app module. So I need to export this directive. Remember, I told you all the view related stuff is by default private unless you export it. And this is what I'm doing. The time pipe I exported, and I'm exporting the show directive. Now go to any page. I'll just go to home component. Maybe it's the simplest one here. Yeah, I'll try to consume this. Say heading. Let's see whether this element is shown or not initially. Here it is, it's shown. Now I'll use show directive. So you'll just say show. It's hidden like that. So that's directive that is hiding. And again, to prove my point, it's not modifying the structure of the DOM. The element is still there. It's just adding a style attribute display none to hide that element. While the ngIf is totally different. We'll see how to build a kind of a ngIf directive. But at this moment, it's just adding, or it's just modifying the elements DOM. So what can you do here in this directive? There are no limits to the amount of things that you can do, because you have your element. You can add any styles, or you can add any attributes. You can do whatever you want here. It's just I'm showing you, you have this element, and or anything that you can do with CSS or jQuery, pretty much you can do it here. So anytime you want to modify the DOM element, it's a good idea that you do it inside directives rather than doing it in components. Components are just like showing some view and some interactions. But if you want to modify some structure, if you want to modify some DOM element, directives are the right place. Okay, so this is actually again not a great directive. When you go back to home component, it just says show, and it is hiding this heading. Doesn't make much sense, because based on certain condition, it should show or hide. That's what I want. So in that case, the inputs comes into picture. So you accept some input. I'll say value or whatever it is, and I'll have a setter. We have learned setters and getters probably in first or second session of this Angular course. So this will have a boolean. Setter is you're trying to set some value. So if the value is true, I'm going to say else this. Okay, if user is saying true, I'm saying show the element as a block. If not, just show the element. I mean, just hide the element. So I don't need to have this logic here. And based on the value, now I want to toggle. So as I said, this works like a at input decorator, and this at input is going to add another attribute to your directive. So I'm going to say value, and this value I'm going to say true. What is this value? This value is nothing but your inputs, and it's an array. If you notice, you can have as many inputs as you want. See, now it is shown. Now I'm going to say false. Let's see if that works. Okay, it simply works. And I don't think there are any errors, no errors in the console. That's well and good. But if you notice, this is kind of ugly way, because I'm consuming my directive and I'm remembering some other property value. So think in a consumer's perspective, whoever is consuming this directive. So it's going to be hard for him to remember two things, like name of the directive and name of the attribute. So if you notice, ngIf doesn't work like this. Rather, ngIf works something like this: true or false. ngIf is the name of the directive. Name of the directive itself can take parameters or values. So can you do something like that rather than just having this value here? Let's see if we can. So instead of writing value as an input, you just write show. If you notice closely, name of the selector and name of the input is same. And here I'm going to say show. And this actually enhances the experience of the consumer. He doesn't need to remember two things. Rather, he can just say show false, show true. So I'm going to have another heading, heading 2, say true. Go to, you see, now Okay, where is heading to? So heading 2 is shown and heading 1 is hidden. This is how. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you should always pass a hard-coded value. It can be a property. So I'm going to say show element. Here I'm going to say show element. And here I'm going to say not of show element. Like this. Works the same way. So that's how you build directives. Very simple. You use a directive and then you get access to it. If you have any input parameters that you want to pass, you can. Usual convention is show. What if you have two input parameters? In that case, you cannot use this trick. You have to go with input, second input. In that case, nobody can help. So, but if you have only one, it's a good idea that you keep the name of the selector and the input name or the attribute name same. It's like the life of consumer becomes easy because he doesn't need to remember a lot of things. Okay, so this is how we build a directive. So there are some improvements that we can make. One thing is I can get rid of this and convert it into a probably a ternary operator statement. Let's say equals to, if value is set, you will say block, else you'll say none. Probably easiest thing. Get rid of this. Here it is. Same output we see, but we have improved our code a little bit. So this directive will work on browser, but it may fail on other devices because we are actually making it specific to browser. The styles, the CSS styles are specific to browser, but we can write even mobile applications using Angular, native mobile applications, and we can write desktop applications also. So if you want this directive to be truly reusable on each and every platform, probably this is not the way that you should be writing this statement. So you will take a renderer private. There is a renderer class which will take care of rendering it on different platforms. So you don't worry about it. You just say what you want to do it, and the renderer object will take care of that. So let me comment this. So here you will say this dot render dot set element style. So this set element style is going to take the element reference. So you'll say element dot native element, and then what you want to do. I want to set my display. Third parameter is the value, and the value is based on the value or the attribute that is set by the consumer, like this. So I'm saying, okay, set the element style, which is nothing but I'm saying the same thing here in a different way. Display property, if the value is set to block, otherwise none. So this renderer will take care of rendering it on mobile or desktop, doesn't matter. So your directive is truly reusable at this moment. See, there is no difference even after changing that. Still, your directive seems to be working fine. Here it is. Okay, let me know if you have any questions. So that's how you write a custom attribute directive. Okay, so how can we write custom structural directives? So this is how you write attribute directives. Structural directives are a little complex because they modify the DOM structure. They remove elements, they add elements, and do all kind of things. So let's see how we can do that. This is not going to modify the structure. Rather, it's just attaches something on the element and removes something like attributes and so on. But structural directives are a little different. So let's go ahead and create. I'll say if directive.ts. One more thing to remember is, let's create a class first. If directive, add directive, say if. So the name, the way you write the name of the directives is also important. The reason is, if tomorrow in the newest version of HTML, if attribute is added, this is going to collide with your directive, because definitely your application would be confused whether it is an HTML element or your directive. So it's a good idea that you have some prefixes, something like this. Name of the company or name of the project are usually a good fit for this. Don't put ng, because ng is kind of reserved for Angular. So just go with something like this. And this should be camel cased, not snake cased. The directive names are camel cased. So something like this. For us, it's okay. I'm not going with any prefix, but usually a prefix is encouraged to avoid naming collisions in future. Maybe today HTML doesn't have this attribute, but we are not sure. This attribute may be added in next version of HTML. So good idea that you take care of that. Paying a little bit of attention will help. So we're building a structural directive here. So I need a constructor because I need some elements. First thing, I'll get my template. That's nothing but template reference. And then the next thing, I'll get my container. That is nothing but view container ref. Okay, all these are part of core. Just add an import statement. I'll explain what they do. So the template is nothing but on which this directive is consumed. And container is which actually modify the structure. It's like this, you'll have a container and inside that this template would be embedded or removed like that. So I'll go with the inputs. I'll say inputs. It's an array. So I'll go with again if input. It's if. And I'll have a setter for if. Whenever somebody sets the value, this setter would be invoked. And this setter will get the value, which is definitely a Boolean value. So I'm going to say if this value is set, or if it is true, I'm going to say this dot container dot create an embedded view. So create embedded view is a method that actually adds something to the container. I'll say this dot template. Else remove it from DOM. I'll say this dot container dot just clear it. So this is how the structural directive can be written. We have written the logic, and now go to and add it to the shade module. So I'm going to say shade.module.ts. Where am I? I want this to be exported because definitely I would be consuming it from different component or different modules component. I'll say if directive. Here it is. Save this. Now I'll go to my home component and try to consume that directive. So I have my DL show directive here. I'm going to have another H1. If directive demo. Make sure this element is shown first, and then we'll try to apply our directive. So this element is shown. Now I'll try to consume it. How can I consume it? Can I say if equals to show EL? Let's see if that works. Okay, it failed and you have some error. The reason is it's not an attribute directive anymore. It's a structural directive. So this asterisk need to be prefixed with the directive name. And this is how you consume the directives, the structural directives to be more specific. See, now it's working. And inspect it. You will have this heading because we have consumed show directive on here, but you don't have that if directive demo heading because it is removed from the DOM completely. That's what structural directive, that's what makes it different from other attribute directives, other directives. While if I make this show element to true, it will come inside your DOM. See, it's there, and definitely if it is there means it would be here inside your DOM, and the show is, this one is hidden and this one is shown like that. So that's the main difference, and that's how you build your structural directives. Okay, let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we'll get into another topic. Okay, now let's go to about component and talk about something which is change detection. So I'll have a button here somewhere. Okay, about component has a separate HTML, so I don't want to again confuse you by switching the files quite often. So I'll try to put it here itself. Let's push these changes so that you'll have it even if I remove. Okay, how this template works, probably you're referring to this one. So this template is nothing but this element. So go to home component and this one. So you are having complete access to this element. So when you have access to this element, be it whatever element you are consuming on, and you can attach something to it, removing attributes, adding styles and showing it, hiding it, and so on and so forth. So this template, so it at the time of structural directives, it would be added to the container or removed to the container. So this container in turn will be inside your DOM. So you're adding or removing it. And that's how the template works. So template here is nothing but your element. And this element sometime can be like this, a complex. So div and you have some elements inside it and so on and so forth. So this is your entire sub template. Inside template, you have a partial template, you can call it. And this is going to be the template for the directive. And that would be added or removed to the DOM. Does that make sense? So in place of attribute directives, this is going to be the element reference. Okay. So when to build directives, as I said, whenever you want to modify something and whenever you are doing it quite few times, such as you want this heading to have a border and you're doing this throughout your application, probably rather than writing a style border attribute every time, you just create a border directive. And whenever you consume this border directive on certain element, a border would be added. You want to have certain elements to have certain background color or certain styles, you'll build a directive like that. So whenever you're doing something, some modification of an element, and you're doing it more and more times, so it's a good idea that you put it inside a centralized file known as directive. Okay, let's get into home component. Now I want to clean this up a bit. So let's get rid of this. So I'll have a button, say plus plus. which increments something, and I'll have an h1 tag which will just display me the count. So the count, I'm going to declare it here, say number, and which would be initialized to 0. So when I click on this button, I want this counter to be incremented. So I'll say inc, and I need to have this inc event here. So I'm going to just say this dot count plus plus. Very simple logic. Make sure our project is compiled and get back to application. So inside home component, I'm clicking on plus. See, now the value is changing. So this is what change detection is. What actually happening is whenever something happens, the value is updated. So see, your view is constantly in sync. Okay, now go back and try to put a set timeout or something like this, set interval. I'll say set interval, which will have another function here. And this is going to increment the counter every second. So I'm saying, okay, set interval, this dot counter, just increment it every second. So as soon as the constructor is initialized, see now it is incrementing. I'm not doing anything. Every second it updates, and that's what your change detection is. So something, there is a change detection system that is running in background and updating the view. If there is no change detection, your view is going to be static. It won't update. The change detection is important concept. Okay, now let's make a web service call. Let me just comment this and make some web service call somewhere here. So I'll say private HTTP. So I'm going to get HTTP client. This auto import doesn't really work here. So just say at Angular common HTTP. And I'm going to make a HTTP service call here, HTTP dot get some URL. And then I subscribe to it. I'll get my response. I'm just going to do. Once I get my response, I'm just going to say this dot count equals to say 1000. If there is any error, I'm going to say this dot count equals to say whatever value it is. Doesn't really matter. Just I want to show you something. So I'm making a web service call here. Go to network tab just to see whether that call is going or not. See, the call went and it is successful. I'm getting 1000. And if you notice, the view is updated. It was 0 initially, now it is 1000. So my point is, when this view is getting updated, is it getting updated every second or every millisecond, or something, or there is some special scenario exist? What, when? So actually it is not getting updated every second or a minute or so. Rather, it is updating at certain in certain situations, such as whenever any asynchronous operation is completed. Asynchronous operation. So what are asynchronous operation? We have learned events are asynchronous operation. Your click event is asynchronous. Your timers are asynchronous, such as set interval, set timeout, all those are asynchronous. Your web service calls are asynchronous. So whenever any of these things are happening, end of that event or timer or web service call, there would be a change detection running inside your Angular. So that change detection ensures that your view is up to date. It checks for the bindings. If the bindings are not up to date, it modifies the value. For instance, see, every time when I click on this, there is change detection running. So this change detection is not as simple as we think. It actually works from top to bottom. It's like you have something like app component, and we have a product list component. Inside that, we may have a product component like this. So if something changes here in the app, change detection would be run inside app component, and that doesn't stop there. Rather, change detection would be run inside its child component, and inside in turn its children, like this. In every component, the change detection would run. So it is top to bottom until it reaches the last child in the hierarchy. All of the bindings would be updated. It would be checked, not the siblings. So if something changed inside app and you have app 2 component, it's a sibling, and this would be unaffected. This would remain unchanged while this would change. So if something is changed inside product component, only its children would be updated, not the other way around, not from child to parent, from top to bottom in one way. So it's not a cycle, and that's very important thing to remember. It's from top to bottom. It runs the change detection. So every component has its own change detector, and once its parent change detector is modified or has run, and its child would be triggered, and so on and so forth. So important thing to remember is the change detector will run whenever any asynchronous operation is completed, not periodically, but whenever somebody has clicked a button, yep, that's an asynchronous operation. That's when it runs. Set timeout, set intervals, web service calls, and so on. Okay, so can I suppress this change detector? Yes, you can. So sometimes it is unnecessary. Okay, something is changed in app component and you want product list to be updated, but you don't want this product component to be updated because you know that there are not going to be any changes, and you think that this component is going to need this component has no need to get updated. In that case, you can suppress that. So take that as an assignment and see if you can come up, go through some articles and see if you can if you can find out something how to suppress the change detector. So again, I would encourage you to do this in the end because this is kind of advanced level where you are more concerned about performance, because whenever this change detection is run from top to bottom, and if you have a huge hierarchy, in that case probably there would be a performance toll. You don't want some components to be updated. If you suppress the change detection system here, all of its children would be suppressed. So in that case, advanced. So once you get comfortable with Angular, try to get into this. You don't need to look into this suppression, all these things now, because it's kind of an advanced topic where you would be more worried about performance. In those scenarios, you would go into this situation. But what is important at this moment for the beginner is the change detection, how it runs, and when it runs. Because without change detection, there is not going to be any updates to the view. Okay, so that's about change detection in a nutshell. Let me commit these. But you have control over this change detection system. As I said, you can suppress it. For some reason, if you want to suppress it, you can. You don't want all the okay, the chain to flow till child, you can definitely stop it in the middle. Okay, so we have a few more minutes, so let's get into another topic. As I said, we have small topics that are left out, and we'll try to complete it today. So the next topic we'll discuss is life cycle events. So there are some events for every component that the component goes through as soon as it is being created. So as soon as you create an object of this component, so we are not actually creating a object of this component. Angular is taking care of that. So whenever a component is created, it goes through some of the events, and that events are called life cycle events. Throughout the life cycle of this component, there are some events. At every stage, it goes through some of the events, and those are life cycle events. So what are those events? ng on init is one. When the component is initialized, as soon as an object is created, and this would execute. We have ng on changes. So components will have at input decorator. So this at input decorator, whenever there is any change in the at input, this ng on changes event would fire because somebody has changed something input attribute, and ng on changes would fire. So if you want to perform some operation when the input is changed, you can handle here. We'll see how to write them in a minute. And then we have ng do check. As I said, you can suppress or continue the change detection. You will do it here. So you can write your own custom logic for checking the bindings or for the change detection. As I said, this is going to be advanced topic. Once you're comfortable with Angular, you come back and check this out. So this ng do check will fire whenever there is any change detection is running. And then next is we have ng on destroy. So whenever the component is about to be removed from the DOM, so you have DOM and the component has done with its duty. So it would be removed from the DOM. In that case, ng on destroy would execute. You would write your cleanup logic. So we'll see these four. There are a couple of others, but uh, we'll see them later. So the first thing is this constructor is overloaded with a lot of logic. You're making a web service call and you're doing all this kind of stuff, and it should not be here. No, again, time consuming logic should be written inside constructor. Constructor should be only for initialization. So you have this counter and you want to initialize it, you will write it inside constructor. And that's the main goal of this constructor, not to make web service call and make your object creation slower. The reason is this is the first function that would be executed when you create an object. If you're writing a lot of stuff here, the object creation is going to be slower. So let's clean this up, everything. And you will use ng on init. So I need to use this because it is outside of the constructor and here. So this is not going to change the component. It's just that I'm using this ng on init hook, and that hook would be executed once the component object is created. So let's go ahead here, go to console. Still you have your logger.one message, and still you have your web service call going here, and still you have your data updated. So any stuff or any time consuming operation such as making web service calls, getting data or whatever it is should be going inside your ng on init hook. So what happens if I misspell it? So if I misspell it, there is no way Angular will know that this is a lifecycle hook, and you will not have any updates here. So you will not notice that logger.one message and the web service call is not going. That's it. So to avoid such mistakes, there is one interface, even though it's not strictly necessary, but a good idea that you go with it. So you just remove on in ng from this method name, and the on in it, the remaining stuff is the name of the interface. So that's the convention followed by Angular team. On in it has ng on in it interface method. Now, if you have any typo, you'll get some feedback already. The compilation will fail. It will not let you compile. So it's a good idea that you implement this interface. That's ng on in it. The next thing is ng on changes. So this doesn't have input attribute. This component doesn't have any input attribute. So I don't think this would be executed or this would be triggered. Let's give it a shot. Go to console. See, we don't have that triggered because it doesn't have it input decorator, so it won't. We'll see that for those components which have it input decorator. And the next one is ng do check. So whenever there is something is changing, so I'll just say console.log inside do check. So make sure we implement the interfaces such as on changes and on destroy. So let's cut them and put it here. Okay, now it says an error. The reason is, okay, for on destroy, I didn't do it. We haven't yet talked about this. Okay, let's get rid of this ng on destroy for a while. And we are only checking on check, on do check. Okay, now come back. Okay, click on this. See, inside do checks. Every time the change detection runs, so this hook would be executed like this. So if you suppress this hook here somehow, and this will not flow till its children. Strictly speaking, the home page doesn't have any children, but if you go to product list component, so if you suppress this inside the do check of product list component, it will not crawl till the end, which is a product component. So that's what I want to say. So ng2 check will execute every time there is any change inside your in your application, such as any asynchronous operation completes, your bindings would be updated and your do check will also get executed. So that's ng2 check, and the last one we'll see is ng on destroy. So go and implement this do ng on destroy. So it is part of on destroy interface, and just uncomment this line, get rid of this. We'll say console.log destroyed. Let's see when this will be destroyed. Come here. Yes, only for home component, because home component doesn't have any children. If home component has any children, the change detection would also run for that child. So we'll see that with an example. Anyhow, we have some time. So let's get into your home component. And I would like to navigate from home to about component. See, it says destroyed. So whenever that element is removed from the DOM and destroyed would execute. So if you, what kind of logic you want to write in on destroy is any cleanup logic that you want to perform, such as unsubscribing from observable. So you'll have an observable, you'll call unsubscribe method on it, or you have this timer. So I'll save this timer somewhere. And I want to get rid of this timer because this will create a memory leak. This function will execute even after this component is removed from the DOM, because this is going to add a callback to the queue each time every second. So it's kind of a memory leak. So it's a good idea that you clear this. So how can you clear this? You'll just say on destroy before the component is being removed. You'll say this dot, uh, maybe clear interval is a method that is available, clear interval, and you'll set this dot timer. And have a console log statement just to make sure that it is executed. Say destroyed. Go to home. This has added timer. So just get rid of this. Clear interval is a global function, so we don't need to add any import. Okay, for some reason it is stopped processing. Kill this. Okay. Meanwhile, let's discuss the order of these events. Order is important. So the first one to execute is constructor. The next one is ng on changes. If there are any input attributes, ng on changes would execute. Then ng on init, and then ng do check, and then finally ng on destroy. Apart from these, and these events are same for components and directives. So you can implement these events inside directives also. So there are some specific hooks only for components, such as ng after content init, ng after content checked, ng after view init, ng after view checked, I believe, like this. So I have written somewhere here, okay, view init and view checked. So those are the events only specific to components because they are related to template, and directive doesn't have template, so it doesn't make sense to have these events. So what are these events? So inside template of a component, you may be using some external content. External content may be your directive, maybe your other components, because definitely a component is nested inside a component, and that's a common scenario. In that case, this once the content is initialized, the external content, and this event would hit. And once checked means the bindings of that content is checked, because Angular checks for the bindings also. So this would hit once the bindings are checked properly, whether the bindings are updated or not, all those things. And then after view init is nothing but the template of the component is initialized. The component will have a template, and that template, and then once the entire template is checked for bindings, that's when this would execute. So why do you need these? These, if we have talked about template variables, template reference variables. So if you want to find a template reference variable from the code behind or from the component class code, you cannot do this in ng on init, because ng on init is hit or executed even before this component content is loaded. So you can only do this inside your view init if you want to find out something. So that's why these events are important. You may not use them very again often, but in case if you want to again find out some elements from the template and perform some operation, and this is where you should be doing it. But these important other events are important. The ng on destroy, ng on init, and so on. Let this run, and we'll see this ng on changes. Okay, now come back, go to home page, and now I'm going to go to about page, navigating. See, it says destroyed, and the timer is cleared. So you'll say clear interval of global function, and by passing the reference of the interval, so it stops adding this callback function to the queue. So we have an event loop or a queue, and every time a callback comes in, that would be executed. So every second, this actually adds a callback to the queue, and we are just clearing it. So any cleanup logic would go here, such as clearing the timers and clearing observables. So you have an observable and you want to unsubscribe it, because observable is going to emit the data constantly, but you want to stop that subscription. In that case, you'll say observable dot unsubscribe. So all those things goes inside your ng on destroy. This would be called just before the component is about to be removed from the DOM. Okay, so we'll see this ng do check and ng on changes more closely. Let's get into product list component. Product list component is here. So I'm going to implement that event. I'll say ng do check. To keep things simple, I'm not implementing the interface, but you should be. Let's do it. The advantage is if you implement it, say implements do check. So you'll have an error here. You can just click on this control dot and implement it. So this is going to implement the method with parameters and return types and everything. So here I'm saying product list change detection. One thing, and I'll get into product component, which is the child component of product list. I'm going to say implements to check. Here I'm going to say console.log product change detection. Okay, now our component is product list component. It's going into it. So it's making a web service calls. The call is a little slow. So if you notice here, see how many times product change detection is run. First thing, product list change detection is run once, and product change detection is 10 times. The reason is you have 10 components here. So that's what I was saying. If a parent is changed, its children are also going to change, and irrespective of number of the children that it has. 10 children it has, and 10 of them has change detection run, even though nothing is changed inside this child component. That's what I mean to say. Why did change detection run here? The reason is it actually made a web service call, and the change detection has triggered. And if this product also has some child component, even that would also be triggered with this change. So that's what I mean to say. And now let's get into product component. It has at input decorator. So whenever there is any change, this ng on changes would hit. So for the first time, even if there is no change in the input attribute, first time by default it runs. So let me do one thing. Say on changes. Let's implement the method. Here it is. So it has an object by the name simple changes. So just add a reference. I'll talk about that, what it is, but first add a console log statement first. I'll say inside on changes event. Say inside on changes like this for 10 times it executes because we have 8 input attribute. But you can catch the previous value also with this simple changes parameter. So this is going to give you the previous value. You'll have previous and current value. So I'm just doing a console.log. So previous value is going to be undefined because this is going to set for the first time, but subsequent changes are going to maintain the previous and current value. Current value is nothing but the changed value. The previous value is what the value used to be. See, if you see here, it has previous value which is undefined, and the current value is nothing but the product that we have set. Current value is this one, and previous value is undefined because this is the first time. If I change something, this product, and the previous value is going to be this one, and current value is going to be the new one. So that's on changes. So one thing to remember again out of all of these, the order is also important. So make sure you follow that order. This is the order. Constructor is the first one to execute, and that's when ng on changes. If at all it has a 8 input decorator, and then ng on init, then do check, and this do check is going to execute whenever there is any change. So can I put my because anyhow this ng on changes is executing if it has 8 input decorator. So can I put my web service call inside this ng on changes instead of ng on init? No, you should not. The reason is ng on init is going to execute only once. Constructor will execute only once. Ng on init will execute only once. While ng on changes, there is no limit. There is no limit. In the number of times the 8 input changes, it that many times it actually executes. So if you're putting these web service calls, every time there is any change, it's going to make a web service call. So not a wise decision to make unless that's your business case. ng2 check is also the same thing. Whenever there is any event is triggered, this ng2 check will trigger. And if you're putting some logic, such as making a web service call, this is going to execute each time. And that is not a wise decision either. So ng on it is the right place if you want to get the initial data. ng on destroy will also execute only once. And all of these all are also going to execute only once, except this ng on changes and ng2 check, and that would execute multiple times in a life of a component. So that's the events, and we are actually at now the time is 8 o'clock. So let me commit these. I'll say lifecycle hooks. So your assignment is, the code is written horrible in some places. When you go to product list component, the reason we have written in this fashion is because we haven't had the knowledge of lifecycle hook. Now you have it. Wherever you see constructor with web service calls and lot of logic, the hardcore processing, move it to ng on init. That's your uh, assignment. So never write this here. And even when you go to product detail component, we have this web service call. See, this is ugly. So it should go inside ng on init. So that is going to be your assignment. Any questions before we wrap up? Okay, if not, we'll meet tomorrow also. Tomorrow is Saturday, but we want to meet because we have 4 more sessions left, 4 or 5. We'll talk about unit testing tomorrow and end-to-end testing on Monday. And then probably we'll try to get into Angular material and see how we can use Angular material or Angular design, material design. And after that, we'll try to set this up manually, the project setup from scratch. So 4, probably, if not 5 sessions we have, and let's complete this. So we'll meet tomorrow as well, same time. Yeah. Thanks, Shashank. I'll talk to you tomorrow then. Bye.